from FVR Contracting and FVR 375 on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed that intro clip first up. Today's video is going to be a bit of a mishmash around the 308 Winchester cartridge, because one of the most common questions I get asked as a professional shooter, as an aerial marksman, as someone who does a lot of ground shooting and thermal shooting, is around the ammunition that I'm using and why I'm using it. So really today what I'm going to aim to do is break down the 308 Winchester, its pros, its cons, dispel a few of the myths around the cartridge. You know, it is without a doubt one of the most commonly used cartridges in the world, if not the most commonly used, and for very good reason. But there's a few terms that are often bandied around with the 308 that are inaccurate, particularly around it being a super high powered round and that type of thing. So we're going to talk to some of those points, and we're going to put up a bit of footage as well, showing how the cartridge works, and you know, then talk through some of the options to do with the cartridge itself. So getting straight to the point around my perspective as a professional on the 308 Winchester, and indeed a pretty keen recreational hunter as well. There's a bunch of reasons why I like the cartridge, and the reality is there's two words. It's versatility and efficiency. So one of the key things for me is that if you're running a 308 Winchester, you can run anything from 90 grain hollow points for dealing with varmints and small animals, right up to 220 grain round nose heavy projectiles to deal with much heavier game. Now, it doesn't do the heavier end of the spectrum that well, but it does a lot of in the middle that well. So it's not excellent as a varmint cartridge, it's not excellent as a big game cartridge, but it certainly is versatile and in the middle, over that sort of medium game size from the light end of the spectrum up to the relatively heavy end of the spectrum. It certainly does all of those jobs well. So the other thing that's pretty important from a design perspective with it is the efficiency of the cartridge. So when you compare the ratio of bore size against powder capacity, it's very sensible on the 308 Winchester, and it's very efficient in terms of its powder burn. So it does a whole lot of things really quite effectively, and the actual case design itself is really quite sensible. So good body taper, it doesn't really jam up too much. You know, it's small, so you can have enough capacity in magazine-fed rifles, but it has just enough powder space in it to get a decent velocity across the range of projectiles that you can use with the cartridge. So in terms of a lot of the work that I do, I don't tend to operate at the extremes of what a 308 Winchester can do. I tend to operate relatively in the middle. So again, heaps of questions about the types of ammunition that I use on a lot of the work that I do, and I'll talk to the aerial shooting stuff first, because that seems to be where I get most of the questions on that. So generally speaking, I'll operate between 130 grain projectile and 180 grain projectile. In the 130 grain stuff, it's more if we're in an area that's got a lot of smaller pigs, we're doing some dog work and that type of thing as well. And then we might run something like these, which are, you can see there, but 130 grain federal hollow points, or 130 grain soft points. So there's a bunch of different types of ammunition, and honestly it's not so much about brand that I select, given the volume of shooting that gets conducted. It's more to do with the efficiency and price point of the ammunition that's available in a broad range of suitable options. So there are a lot of different brands of ammunition out there that will effectively do the same thing in a 308. So you know, you can generally go off projectile weight as a ballpark for what those things are. So again, for lighter stuff, 130 grain, and you know, that's the sort of stuff there. The American Eagle hollow point, some of the OSA 135 grain loads, that type of thing. So that's at the lighter end of the spectrum, not something I use a lot, but certainly do use on occasion. In the middle of the spectrum is what I use for 99% of the work that I conduct. So most of those videos, and certainly that intro clip and a couple of the other ones I'll put up shortly, are using ammunition that sits right bang in the middle, which is the sweet spot for the 308 Winchester, which is a 150 grain projectile. So it's heavy enough to penetrate effectively, it's light enough to have sufficient velocity to expand and have good terminal ballistics, and it's about the right weight for the powder capacity of the 308 cartridge. Now, it doesn't have the best ballistic coefficient nor sectional density, which again is in a relationship between, for sectional density, the length of the projectile over the width of the calibre. And your ballistic coefficient obviously is that description of the projectile's ability to defeat wind drag. So because again it's a little bit shorter and fatter than some of the other 30 calibre options out there in a 150 grain projectile, it doesn't have particularly high numbers in either of those. But what it does have is enough velocity for those typical engagement ranges where you're hunting medium-sized game, which for most of us is going to be between 0 and 200 metres. And certainly for me when I'm aerial shooting, it's going to be somewhere between 5 metres if we can, and we can get low enough. Typically 20 to 30 metres, and sometimes as far as 100 metres, depending on what the situation is, with tree height, terrain, hazards, that sort of thing. And you know, as I said, for your typical recreational hunting environment, a 200 metre shot is a pretty long shot, and a 150 grain projectile with the speed it has at the start out of a 308 Winchester is really effective in that type of scenario. So there's heaps of options there with 150 grainers. Couple of options I've got here, so a couple of 150 grain loads you can see there. So PMC bronze line, you know, good ammunition, your typical sort of Winchester PowerPoint, you know, your Seiko game head, all that type of stuff, your Federal blue box. Certainly good options in that 150 grain bullet weight. Now the other weight that I tend to use fairly regularly in the 308 cartridge is 180 grain. So I don't use a lot of that sort of 165 middle of the road style bullet weight. It doesn't really fit for what I do. So that 150 grain bullet weight is very relevant for feral pig management. It's an excellent choice in that role, again given that blended capability of velocity and projectile weight with enough penetration without having too much penetration, and certainly the foot-pounds of energy that you're able to place into a target. At the other end of the spectrum, when I'm conducting control work that's on bigger animals, which happens from time to time, and you can work out what those sorts of things are. So, you know, problem bovines, you know, wild feral horses, that type of thing, tend to step up and use heavier bullet weight in line with the recommendations that exist in the Australian industry. And typically that'll be a 180 grain projectile, which in my opinion is in reality about as heavy as you want to go with the 308 Winchester, which is again due to that relationship with powder capacity. So you go heavier than 180 grain and you tend to really drop the velocity down to a level that's not useful and doesn't deliver enough energy on target. The 180 grain loads are useful because they have got a good sectional density, being 180 grain 30 calibre projectile, so they penetrate fairly well, and at close to moderate ranges you have enough velocity to achieve fairly reasonable expansion when you hit your target, which is definitely a good thing. So again, I tend to use these 180 grain style projectiles, and you know, here's an example here. You know, your Federal 180 grain. It's actually a fairly soft projectile on the Federal, so you can use that from on pigs and that sort of thing as well. And then you have some other more specialist loads like these. So it's not a particularly fancy box, but that's, for example, is a Winchester load with 180 grain Woodley projectile in it, which is an Australian-made bonded projectile. You know, so obviously that one opens a lot more slowly and penetrates a lot more deeply. So on heavier game, it's a better option. But again, you've got to keep in mind the key theme of the 308, which is that it is not inherently a particularly fast cartridge, and I'll talk more to that issue in a sec. complaints that gets made fairly regularly in a lot of the aerial shooting content in particular is how quickly the animals drop, and how the round being used must be ultra powerful, that sort of thing. And it's an interesting point to talk about. So I guess in the context of what a lot of the other content is out there on YouTube, you quite often see people using underpowered cartridges for the purposes of shooting medium-sized animals. So calling a spade, we're talking about the 223, which is used regularly in the conduct of shooting videos and hunting content. Particularly a lot of the aerial shooting stuff has got AR-15s in it. It's quite common. Look, it can work in some scenarios, but it definitely is underpowered when considering shooting feral pigs, or feral hogs as they're often termed in the US, which are quite a tough animal pound for pound. Other cartridges like 350 Legend, 300 Blackout, that type of thing, still fairly underpowered in comparison to the sort of energy requirements that are required for taking medium game. So in terms of that with terminal ballistics, so there's no one way to measure how effective a cartridge is going to be in a particular role, but there's lots of different things you can consider to assist your understanding of how it's likely to perform in those scenarios. One of those key metrics is foot-pounds of energy that the cartridge generates. Now that can't be considered on its own because there's a whole bunch of other factors that come into play, such as projectile construction, which obviously have a significant impact on how that works. However, as a ballpark and a guideline, it's generally understood that to effectively destroy or kill a medium-sized game animal or feral animal pest, you need 1,000 foot-pounds of energy at the point of impact. So not at the muzzle where it hits the animal. The retained velocity in consideration of the weight of the projectile need to equal 1,000 foot-pounds of energy on target. For larger animals, and by larger, I mean you're talking sort of a couple of 100 kilos and heavier, that type of thing. It's generally recommended you have 1,500 foot-pounds at the target end. So when you consider a lot of those other lighter cartridges that are out there, your 223s and that sort of thing, they barely make that at the muzzle, regardless of what bullet weight you're using. So again, I'm speaking quite generically here. There are some specialised loads that do achieve those numbers, but as a general rule, they don't. And that's pretty much why you often see a lot of those cartridges performing fairly poorly, or well-hit animals running some way before they fall over, etc., etc. And then you take a video where you have someone using a 308 Winchester running appropriate loads, around that 150 grain projectile weight. Generally speaking, those loads are somewhere around 2,850 feet per second at the muzzle, and in that sort of 0 to 50 metre range, they're generating around 2,500 and a little bit more foot-pounds of energy on the target. So you've got an excess of energy there. You have relatively good speed at the point of impact, certainly above 2,400 feet per second, which is generally recognised as that speed that where you get hydrostatic shock. And hydrostatic shock is where you get that transmission through the animal's bodily fluids of shock, which assists in disrupting the vitals of the animal and then causes its rapid demise. But the reality is, the 308 Winchester is not what I would term a powerful cartridge. It's versatile and it's adequate, and it has enough power for medium game and medium game at the larger end of the spectrum in that normal shooting range of 0 to 200 metres. So that's really where it shines. And despite the fact that it does have an appropriate amount of foot-pounds, and when used with the right projectiles is very effective, you still got to place your shots. So it's no different to anything else. And a lot of the footage that you see where animals are instant lights out is more to do with that good shot placement. So shots that are going through a number of vital organs with the correct angle for that shot, and or indeed central nervous system is being taken out with that shot. So whether that's between the shoulder blades for aerial shooting and hitting the spine on the way through, then destroying both lungs, or whether you're talking headshots and that type of thing. Typically, in a lot of the footage you've seen in my videos, you're not aiming to take headshots on animals out of an aircraft. You're generally aiming for the largest kill zone. which is going to be a chest shot from the long axis of the animal. So essentially you're trying to put the round down through the spine and into the lungs and heart, arcing forwards through the animal when you're shooting from behind. So that's the normal placement there. So I think one of the other issues that is often talked about with the 308 Winchester, and certainly people love to talk about its heritage and what it does, and it's definitely relevant, is its military background and origin, and some of the uses there. So the 308 Winchester is the 7.62 by 51 rimless NATO in its military designation. It's a very, very common round. It's used in a number of medium-sized machine gun platforms. It's used as a sniper round, and it's used in a whole bunch of different battle rifles all around the world with a bunch of different nations. And the primary reason that the 308 or 7.62 by 51 is used in that role is more to do with the efficiency again and the versatility of the cartridge. So again, lots of different loads for lots of different situations. The ability to deliver good ballistics without having a overdone powder capacity, which then causes weapon wear and damage and that sort of thing. And it's certainly a very trainable round, as in you can put a lot of rounds through a firearm with a 308 without wearing it out excessively. It doesn't have excessive recoil when in consideration of some of the other cartridges that are out there, and therefore it's a fairly trainable thing. So I think that's where some of that reputation around it being super powerful, super long range, capable cartridge come from. The fact that it can be used in a sniper rifle doesn't mean that it's an awesome long range round. It doesn't have a lot of retained energy out there, and certainly compared to some of the other offerings that are around the place now, regardless of what you do with the projectiles you put in it, to get the ballistic coefficient you require, which again is that ability to defeat air drag so that it shoots flat and isn't deflected too much via wind drift, you've got to run a very heavy projectile, which means that you are dropping velocity significantly, which means that you start to get to a point where it's not really useful in that role. So again, a lot of countries do use the 308 Winchester as an anti-personnel sniper round. With a quality marksman who knows what they're doing with really good equipment, it definitely is suitable in that role. For argument's sake, out to around 800 meters. But in reality, that's not really where the cartridge shines. So that being the case, in my opinion, where does the cartridge shine? So I've sort of alluded to it the whole way through the video, but it has a couple of areas where it does really, really well, even in consideration of some of the other more modern offerings that are out there. So it's a moderate size case with a decent size and weight projectile. It shines on medium size game animals and feral animals in that range of around 0 to 250 meters. That's really where it performs quite well. At the muzzle, you'd expect with 150 grain load, you're delivering around 2,600-ish foot-pounds of energy, depending on the nature of your load. And certainly in terms of your drop and drift, so it's not the most flexible arrangement with those lighter weight projectiles in terms of defeating wind drift and having a good ballistic coefficient so that it retains its velocity fairly effectively. But the realities of a trajectory of 150 grain load, if you started out around 2 inches high and 100 meters, you're going to be around about on point of aim again at 200 metres, and you're probably going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 10 inches low, depending on the exact projectile you're using, out at 300 metres, which is certainly easy enough to hold for with any marksman who has or rifleman who has a reasonable idea of what they're doing in the field, just done a little bit of practice. So, that's pretty versatile, and it really fits that space well. The reality is, for most of us, we're not out there shooting at things 700-800 metres away. We're hunting. When we're dealing with animals, we're trying to get as close as we can, and we're trying to get the most humane shot that we can to make sure that we put our animal down with one shot, which is the key point of why we're doing what we're doing. And the 308 Winchester is great in that role. It has enough terminal ballistics to achieve that on a whole range of game and feral animals, up to those sort of larger sizes. Now you definitely can push it a little bit further with some specialised loads, some heavier projectiles, that type of thing. But again, if we're talking ballpark of where the cartridge really shines, it's in that sort of lighter animal up to about a couple of 100 kilos is where the 308 does its best work. And certainly I've used the 308 for a number of years for recreational hunting, target shooting, and professionally now I use it regularly. In fact, I've probably fired more 308 than I've fired any other cartridge, and that includes with my military background. So I've certainly put a lot of rounds downrange using the 308 Winchester, and it's one of those things. I love the cartridge. I don't love it necessarily for the ballistics. I love it for the efficiency, and it's just a good, honest cartridge that does what it is designed to do well. It isn't as fancy as some of the modern stuff out there, but it certainly performs across a fairly broad spectrum. In terms of high-level feral animal control, where we're running programs where you're shooting a lot of animals, the efficiency of the 308 is really, really good. So you can run lighter cartridges on some of these programs, but when you're dealing with mobs of 80 or 100 pigs, and you might have some heavy cover, etc., out of an aircraft, as you're moving along, you do find yourself in a position where if you are inefficient with your shooting, or the pigs aren't dropping each time you hit, and then you've got to follow up under humane destruction protocols and make sure that animal's humanely destroyed, you do have potential in heavy cover to lose the rest of the mob. So typically in that type of role, you are better off using something like a 308, which is a little bit heavier, has a bit more punch, and certainly puts things down fairly quickly. The other thing I tend to find myself doing an awful lot of as a feral animal controller here in Australia is using thermal optics to shoot. And that's, again, another place where the 308 really shines. So thermal is the latest, greatest tech out there for conducting ground-based feral animal control and pest management. There's no doubt about that. But it certainly has some limitations, and one of those limitations is that, particularly up here in northern Australia, where we're dealing with high ambient temperatures and high humidity all the time, you often can't see through cover necessarily that effectively. And so one of the issues you have there, if you're running a lighter cartridge, and I do run smaller cartridges from time to time, depending on what the jobs are, things like 204 Ruger, 223, that type of thing. But if you hit cover with those type of cartridges running lighter, more frangible projectiles, what you often find is that projectile won't get through to its target. So for me, again, even on some of the smaller animals, on niche conservation jobs and that sort of thing, I'll run the 308 to destroy feral cats, because if you've got a feral cat behind grass or light cover, and you don't pick up that cover in your thermal because that cover is the same ambient temperature as the air, so you physically can't see it and that sensor won't pick it up, then again, which is one of the very mild flaws that thermal has, then running a slightly heavier cartridge combination with a suitable projectile is a pretty good option. So you can shoot through a little bit more of that cover, and you are far more likely to have a better outcome. So again, the 308 Winchester fits perfectly in that space. And I think one of the things that can't be understated at all about the 308, which is absolutely amazing compared to most other things out there, you can nearly walk into any firearms store in Australia the US, New Zealand, Africa, anywhere in the world, you're going to find a box of 308 on the shelf. So a lot of the other stuff that's out there now, the world's become a bit of an odd place with firearms related items and ammunition supply, and so it's never a guarantee. But 308 Winchester, you got a fair chance that you walk into anywhere, that's going to be on the shelf. So if you've got a rifle or two in 308, you're always generally going to be okay in terms of having a hunting arm or your favourite target rifle ready to go. And that's certainly a significant advantage. So, getting to the point of wrapping up the video, I hope you've enjoyed some of the discussion that we've had around the 308 Winchester and what it does well and some of its limitations. I've been asked a few times, what my favourite cartridge is, and the 308 Winchester isn't my favourite cartridge. It's certainly a cartridge that I respect and use very, very regularly, and I think it is a very good cartridge at what it does. It isn't my favourite, but I'll probably have some more eclectic tastes than some other people in terms of cartridges that I really like. I'm not actually going to cover that in this video today, because I'll certainly do another video at some point in the future that talks about my favourite cartridge. But the 308 Winchester, it's a versatile cartridge. It is available. It has good terminal ballistics. It has satisfactory exterior ballistics, so its ability to find its way to the target is certainly there, and it's just efficient and versatile, which is what it's all about. It's definitely a good choice. If you're new to hunting, new to centerfires, new to shooting in any way, shape or form, or you're conducting the type of shooting where you might need to use a fair bit of ammunition during feral animal control or that type of thing, there's very few cartridges that are going to be better than the 308 in that role. So it's versatile. It's something I'm never going to change for aerial shooting. It just really, really fits that really well. And there's an awesome number of great rifles out there that are made in 308. In fact, it's a point I probably should have covered earlier. There is nearly every single type of rifle that is produced is made in 308. So the range and options that are there are certainly awesome. Anyway, again, hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to put some comments down the bottom, and within those comments, also feel free to jot down any thoughts on future content you'd like to see along these lines with that discussion, some of the detail, a little bit of technical stuff if you want to see it, and I'll see what I can do. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers.